This recording is going to be a rehash of a few themes that have been in about three of my prior recordings, but they're worth sort of packing more tightly together. So, to understand the psychological component of identity politics, which is quite a insidious, dark, pernicious force um, that creates all these weird sorts of double standards in its weird kind of narrative, which is allowed to sort of leverage very dishonest forms of pseudo intellectualism in order to sort of to concretize the case and the claims that it makes, in how it gives itself a huge amount of leeway to establish its bank of facts, which are mostly controversial and mostly shrouded in, essentially a reductive, socially constructive, sort of premise that is a kind of, which really begs its own question. Is sort of the conclusion of its narrative is used in the premise of surmounting that narrative, which is essentially to believe in this kind of canonical categorization of society through identity and through the cause of the identity and differential, sorts of measures that are identity centric, which therefore has this huge mismatch in that you can ignore reality, you can ignore individual reality, uh, because everything then just gets lumped into generalizations and statistics that have to do with identity. Essentially, uh, a poor black person can be just as oppressed as a kleptocratic elite. A rich businessman can be equally systemically oppressed. And because of that convoluted sort of tokenism that the cause of the identity manufactures, you can have this whole divide and this divorcing and distortion of people's actual interests. Their political interests and the political economy essentially gets distorted in the cause of the identity. And in making the cause of the identity essentially this unilateral vehicle for any kind of progress, this weird kind of dogmatic claim that only the identity, and by a kind of uh, a, a project of racialism and identitarian pride and the rehabilitation of an identitarian pride is the only way to effect meaningful or measurable change, completely distorts the goalposts. It completely distorts society into this oversimplified reduction of what is essentially a fake solution. And psychologically, this comes in tethering self-esteem to the cause of the identity. The idea is that individuals can't have self-esteem if they don't have if they're not tethered to an identity that has a kind of a group pride or something like that, and therefore, because of that implicit assumption which is built into identity politics, then you can force people to deal with generalizations and the truth of generalizations, in those kinds of paradoxical pseudo intellectual bullshit, essentially, which therefore allows them to aggregate statistics and generalizations to make their vague claim that this is the only way to make a tangible difference or to move anything, or to improve anything, or to move things forward. And so, because of this weird sort of convoluted logic based within it, which is essentially, well, if the generalization isn't important and the rehabilitation of group pride isn't important, then are you saying that people don't deserve group pride, which as it's implicitly asserted that that's the only way for individuals to aggregate self-esteem is only by attaching themselves to an identity. And so I mean, and this is all baked into the claims and the accusation of white privilege, essentially, that it's to create a false dilemma. White privilege is essentially to say, well, either white supremacy is true or it's insidious and it's the cause of an external locus of control. And that's essentially the whole intellectual argument of critical race theory and identity politics is to leverage this false dilemma that either what you're dealing with is actual white supremacy because whites are superior, or it's an insidious conspiracy against people of color, and it's what's holding them back. And if we can't identify it via critical race theory, if we can't accept that it is systemic oppression and that it's real and that it is this external locus of control, then essentially you are depriving people of their self-esteem that they could otherwise garner via a group pride, which is essentially owed to them by a system that has been finagled by the people on the top. And so essentially it bakes in this fascistic conception of society where you look and interpret reality through the cause of the identity. It's an identity-centric worldview. And so, once you've got all of these things connected psychologically, you can see how empowering it is. I mean that slightly sarcastic or ironically, how empowering it is to toxic individuals, to individuals that essentially then can leverage the narrative of what it is essentially a slave morality, of an external locus of control, which can always be leveraged to excuse any failing, so that there's no accountability for anything. Accountability gets mixed up into the giant sausage factory, into the giant sausage machine of these vague claims of systemic oppression and an external locus of control. And that if you are trying to divert attention from that grand polemic, from that grand racialistic narrative of social constructs, if you're not willing to essentially involve yourself into that drama, and be on the right side, then you are part of the conspiracy theory, essentially. So, I mean, this is the formula of cultural totalitarianism. But what's more is because essentially of this strange psychological dependence on the identity. And so this is the reinvigoration of the racial imagination. This is the complete opposite of the morality of the 90s. And what's disgusting is that, so many people, they still believe that racism is wrong. We've sort of baked that into the culture. But now, because they have redefined what racism means into this racialized, racialistic worldview, into this fascistic worldview, they have found a way to sort of hack the system. They have found a way to conceal their poisonous racialistic program and agenda, which is essentially the agenda of any disgusting fascistic racialism. Now, the political consequences of all of this, or the consequences for the political economy, is that essentially, I mean, this is fascist politics now, because when you have a cause of the identity, which then involves you in these generalizations and creating programs and benefits for people who are always going to be selected on the basis of being a token of that group and of rehabilitating some kind of group pride. And if people are told that they're supposed to garner self-esteem via their association with their group, you've got, and this is why it's a slave morality, is because it doesn't deliver what it promises to deliver. It always fails. And because when it fails, it can't take ownership of its own actions, it's just more fuel for the scapegoating. It's just more for the leveraging of the external locus of control. Oh, the conspiracy against us is so insidious. So it has uh, this endemic, inexorable, doom spiral sort of within itself, and so it can't ever self-examine itself as being a self-induced, self-inflicted, ideological self-sabotage and self-fulfilling prophecy. Um, that its complaints grow stronger the more its fake solutions and its artificial development, because essentially when you give people things based on, not based on merit, but based on this kind of tokenism, you have to at the same time lean on an ever increasing dependence and reliance on identity consciousness. So you're inflating the racialism to new grand heights, and so it never sort of fixes the complaint that is at its core. It only aggravates it further. Um, yeah, I mean, okay, wait, let me just. There's some other important points around here, but I mean, so that's the sort of the general thesis. But essentially, the really the corruption part of this, really, because it is a corruption of morality. It is what Nietzsche would have described as a slave morality. Um, and this has to do with its dependence on an external locus of control in order to conform and verify its narrative, conform to this oversimplified one size fits all. Everything can be reduced into its terms because it 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 only tracks generalizations, and so in that middling ground of generalizations, then you're allowed to cherry pick your facts to conform and verify your narrative, and then you're allowed to disregard everybody else's facts as controversial and distortions. So it's got this reality filter based inside of itself because it's so obsessed with the project of racial identity, and because essentially the project of rehabilitating the group pride and the racialist pride and excavating history and trying to sort of reframe it or something like that, essentially because this is not a stable source of what you know this is not ever going to result in self-confidence. This is never going to bring people to a state of self-confidence. And so because you've got this ideological self-esteem, which is much more close to narcissistic supply, if you can understand that essentially identity politics is like borderline personality disorder, which has, to me, quite, at least in this archetype, I would say it also has a large component of vulnerable narcissism built into it, where essentially the accusation of white privilege, which is just as vulnerable narcissists will kind of pre-select their own sort of narcissistic injury so that they can leverage a narrative that they have somewhat manipulated into bringing into focus, because it gives them a convenient way of uh, uh, essentially getting people to involve themselves in essentially what becomes an introjective identity, which you can only extract from other people and get other people to essentially tender to you narcissistic supply if uh, if you can force them or compel them to agree to uh, the situation which has been craftily manipulated, that has been set, that has been framed. The setting has been concocted in order to facilitate a very psychologically necessary function, in what I would call a hybridized form of borderline personality disorder. Uh, okay, okay, let me just talk about the narcissistic supply. So, what the vulnerable narcissist is skilled at doing essentially is in not trying to openly demand, in a positive sense, of claiming narcissistic supply from other people, but by engineering a in an involvement, a kind of an interaction into some dilemma, in which case either outcome of that dilemma results in a claim, in a reactive claim being made against the person that has fallen into the trap, into the pit that has been set up by the vulnerable narcissist. And if you can essentially compel people to answer your riddle, to involve themselves in the dilemma that you have concocted, then you can have essentially a pre-arranged uh, uh, set of expectations, which all you have to do is defend, and in the defense of those expectations, you end up extracting narcissistic supply. That's generally what the vulnerable narcissist is trying to do. Um, now, uh, uh, the cause of the identity is very much like borderline personality disorder, um, because, well, I mean, what I would call the selective memory component, and the essentially the radical reorientation of interpreting reality on the fly, what is often called alloplastic defenses, um, which essentially means to treat reality like a malleable sort of putty that will fill in the gap in terms of protecting the kind of the codependence, or the linkage and the tethering that the borderline has to another person's you know emotional uh, susceptibility to the borderline's reality. The borderline really, they need to believe that somebody else is prone to helping process their emotional state, and that they are susceptible to essentially, the borderline requires a certain level of psychological penetration, um, which is often quite, sort of, uh, uh, it has a kind of, it has a sadistic kind of intimacy sort of involved in it. But they need other people essentially to be a kind of audience to their exhibition of their emotional state and their internal state. Slightly, there are other elements as to why, but this is essentially because they outsource their ego function. They don't like to have they don't like to do the work of meta-analysis. They don't like having to track their own purposes, They want somebody else essentially to be a parent to their emotions. They need an external parent, and which is quite funny as well, because this is how fascistic society generally operates itself. Um, is that you need a Führer means savior, the savior of the identity. But yeah, so I mean, this is a bit. I do think a very strong case can be made that essentially identity politics and fascism in general is um, is essentially a hybridized personality disorder which has been inculcated into an ideology and an ideological narrative. Um, I mean, the parallel is very easy to make. I mean, the Nazis believed that they were genetically superior. That was how their mythological narrative was sort of described. But what is the difference between genetic superiority and a claim for genetic superiority and a claim for an inherited moral superiority, which is also essentially a mythologized historical narrative? These things are formulaically identical. There's no substantive difference. It's the same kind of mythologizing of history um, in order to ground a claim around a kind of identitarian project. Okay. Anyway, look, there aren't, because essentially the identity though is the borderline, not the necessarily the adherent. The adherent might be, especially the more intellectual ones, might simply be kind of more vulnerable narcissists, or what I have called cerebral histrionics. Um, yeah, let me just let me not go off in too many different directions, but uh, I mean, in the same way that there's a huge amount of comorbidity within cluster B personality disorders, and in the same way, identity politics facilitates a whole eclectic array of proclivities within the cluster B. I mean, especially in how the ideology allows for a kind of a collectivization of a kind of hive mind. So essentially, you know, you, you are abrogating your ego function that then is being essentially mediated and um, delivered to you via the ideological vision of always having this external locus of control to leverage as a scapegoat. Um, which I mean, in the most general sense, what that's going to facilitate is essentially um, psychopathy, because when people don't have and I mean, obviously psychopathy is one of the cluster B uh, is one of the cluster B personality disorders, or antisocial personality disorder, as it's called in the literature. But I mean, it's psychopathy. But I've also made very strong cases that I believe that borderlines are not merely secondary psychopaths; that they are just as psychopathic as psychopaths. And that their alloplastic defenses are not alloplastic defenses. This is actually a strategy of alloplasticity, which is used essentially to conceal and in order to insulate their psychopathic. Uh, uh, because I mean, it's quite a thing essentially to keep your ego function suspended and to keep it essentially externalized. It actually takes quite a lot of subconscious work, and what I've also called as a special. I'm not going to go into my model of personality right now, but essentially what I call the inner child. there's quite a lot of concerted structure, that they are actively engaged in um, uh, sustaining their particular relationship that they have, with their ego function. Uh, but anyway, the what the ideology does in an overarching sort of sense is it gives people a sort of an open road in order to expand in this field of psychopathy. That essentially the ideology gives you a very clear um, section, uh, uh, that you can use these radical instruments of intellectual dishonesty, that you can play these weird sorts of you know strange interpretations and double standards, uh, and you can essentially use these things to extract narcissistic supply. The problem is that in the same way that all narcissists have problems with narcissistic supply, is that the narcissist himself or herself does not obtain the narcissistic supply. The false self obtains it. And this is the same problem with especially the hybridized issue, or the hybridized borderline personality disorder that is identity politics, is that essentially the self-esteem that is being accrued never is received by the individual. It's only received by the identity, which is essentially a disembodied abstraction. It's a fake concept. It's a, and in as much as that their rhetoric tries to superimpose the identity on top of the self-image, essentially the only reading you have as to the status of the identity is via the ideology, and the ideology has no positive way of grounding any claim in truth. They can only negatively contrast reality out of extracting it from a kind of damage or retributivistic sort of maiming that they have done against the scapegoat. And so in some sense they need the scapegoat to measure their progress. Essentially, they can only know that they have progressed anywhere to the extent to which that they have damaged, relatively speaking, the scapegoat, because essentially it's all based on that juxtaposition. It's all based on that prime contrast. That's how essentially empty their whole ethos is that essentially without putting someone through the false dilemma of trying to sort of square the circle of white privilege and trying to force people into confronting that false dilemma, uh, they have no idea about what progress looks like. That's the only definition they have of progress. So, okay, again, this is the part where I talk about more practical sort of politics. The thing is that when you've got people programmed this way, it doesn't matter what's actually happening on the ground. It doesn't matter how empowering you are to individuals. It just matters how empowering you are to the identity. And so you can do whatever you want. You can employ policies which essentially all help kleptocratic plutocrats or demagogues or politically connected, sort of cadre and small cliques that essentially all somehow exist under the umbrella of the identity, just the same as anyone else. And you can create devastating conditions. You can completely destabilize and destroy things. But it doesn't matter, because the only thing that matters is essentially putting someone through a false dilemma and extracting a kind of ideological narcissistic supply from them. And so you can essentially displace people's real interests by giving them fake interests, by giving them the interests of the identity, and essentially by giving them the obsession with an identity-centric worldview and politics, is you don't actually have to ever give them self-confidence, because if you actually gave them self-confidence, then you couldn't keep on promising them a kind of ideological self-esteem, which the only way to do it is by this kind of this strange sort of identitarian redistribution of a kind of social justice, which is that's what social justice means in the identitarian sort of landscape. Is it means stealing from a generalization or taking from a generalization and giving it to another generalization. It's completely disconnected from what the actual word social justice means, which it can only mean anything in a non-racialist and a non-sexist paradigm, that social justice is for the individual, and it's always against it's the juxtaposition between society and the individual, not against group versus group. And so, you've got people that, with their fascistic worldview and premises, they have already sort of reinterpreted morality and all moral consideration and moral questions into this poisonous uh, disorientation of the political economy. Um, and obviously, this moral corruption is lockstep with the corruption of the state and essentially the weakness and mismanagement in governance. Because you can't govern effectively when you are run by such a corrupt morality. You can't um, you can't empower people because you can't give them self-confidence, because if you gave them self-confidence, you would essentially be denying them the ideological source of identitarian self-esteem, which is kind of like the thing that never fills. It never makes you whole. You always need more, and the only way that you know that you have any of it to begin with is that it's tethered to this juxtaposition. So it can't even measure absolute progress. It can't, because it doesn't have a positive claim. It only has a negative claim based on essentially a false dilemma. And so by reducing everything to that false dilemma, they can just take people hostage at will. They can just sort of randomly select someone and say, well, okay, well, now you have to answer for your generalization, and you have to, let's not compare you and your life story. Let's compare your generalization with a cherry pick generalization on my side, which, people also forget this, where they look at statistics and they don't understand that statistics are made up of people that have very, very different experiences and very, very different, you know, um, outcomes. Just because some people's averages are different to other people's averages doesn't mean that individuals within any group, don't have very different. You kind of, and yeah, the so when you start to manage, society based on sort of these weird kind of identity obsessed, I don't think you can even call it a morality. I mean, this identity obsessed bigotry uh, and when you frame everything in terms of the systemic oppression, which is as if to kind of completely uh, ignore essentially the opportunity that this country has had to transform, which it has self-sabotaged, and essentially the power of uh, uh, of expanding opportunity, and having a meritocracy, and having essentially and focusing on developmental metrics, and making tangible investments, and maximizing how to develop a country, when all of that essentially has gone out the window because of the focus on this very short-sighted and exploitative, sort of self-destructive um, sort of race baiting, and this whole sort of project of making race baiting, making policy essentially a race baiting calling card, essentially, that essentially will, this is just such bad policy that essentially its only redeeming force is that essentially it's promoting the idea of identity politics and identity consciousness, and how we must essentially change our minds essentially by becoming a kind of anti-racist as a way to um, which essentially means like, no, just have a racial imagination, just put it in reverse, somehow, and that is the solution to the problem. When essentially it just makes you more deranged and disorientated and unable to see reality and how to actually be effective at anything. Um, Instead of making intelligent policy decisions, we make essentially this strange cult and religious sort of this weird kind of, I mean, it's a weird kind of corrosive ethos, because it's sort of like, well, as we self-sabotage and we go down this road, if anyone speaks up, then essentially by dogpiling them and destroying those people that complain, that shows how pure we are. It's this and then there are obviously people with personalities which they have always looked for opportunities essentially to extract narcissistic supply by being a sort of a field marshal of some kind of in-group purity or morality, because they're not capable essentially of operating as individuals. They need to be associated to a kind of to a collective in order to yeah, I mean, sadly, I mean, so much of this is, I think, it does have very closely to do with psychopathy, and essentially how psychopathy has, even now I would say, overtly become a kind of cultivated um, cultural trend. I mean, for me, I can't believe that people haven't already made the link between this and overt fascism and overt racism. Um, I mean, that's always what fascism was. It was just a kind of, it was a very convoluted pseudo intellectual sort of umbrella that would always just amalgamate any positive titles that it could get its hands on. I mean, the Nazis, they called themselves socialistic. They called themselves National Socialists. I mean, I'm sure that they would have called themselves pro social justice as well. Um, they just they absorbed everything good into their brand. That's what they do. They destroy meaning and language, and they just conform it to their narrative and to the formula. But the formula, um, I mean, yes, it's insidious. I mean, the thing that also should be said is about essentially, because it's very easy to always diagnose whatever is missing in your life as a lack of self-esteem. So it's like, because that's very introverted. It's very sort of feeling focused. It's very subjective. It's very autistic in a lot of ways. That how you can just frame everything that you lack as a deficiency in self esteem. And when you are that way inclined, you can always essentially complain that someone is depriving you of self esteem, when the fact is that actually you don't have self-confidence. And it's correct that you don't have self-confidence, because you haven't earned your self-confidence. You have to actually develop competency sometimes to arrive at self-confidence. You have to navigate life. You have to grow and learn and accumulate experience. You have to open your eyes. You have to understand things that you don't yet understand. Um, but if you can just make it about self-esteem and not about genuine, and you lie to people about how to genuinely acquire self-confidence, then you've essentially created this one size fits all solution, this of an oversimplification, which essentially gets more and more sort of hypocritical, more and more ludicrous, and involves more and more sort of very strange double standards and projecting onto reality of a very sophisticated narrative, which is essentially, it's like a conspiracy theory. You can't. Uh, it's got so much tautological assumptions interconnected that it depends on in the foundation of that narrative. It's just it's I mean, the thing that worries me the most is just how essentially, and this has always been the same for racists and fascists, is that essentially the conclusion the conclusions that are generated by their narrative are all the premises that are used in order to believe the narrative. It's like all of their claims beg the question. All of their accusations beg the question. It's such a self-referencing sort of slow motion train wreck, and it's that level of dishonesty, that level of intellectual sophistry. Um, it is a bit tricky to complain about, or in terms of confronting and essentially, because you're not going to convince the person that you're talking to, but at least to convince other people that the whole thing is a pack of lies, that it's but I would say the only thing is that if you put in, when you're sort of debating with these people, if you put in essentially a form of individual integrity which you are holding the line on and you are defending, because they will always attack your integrity. So if you just use your own integrity essentially as the aegis, um, and you will have to create a unique defense of it, that will come from you as an individual. But that essentially is the only barometer, is the only way to create a record and to force people to track with the ideological fraud that the narrative requires in order to sustain it. Um, Essentially, it requires someone with an actual individual personality and integrity to defend their own integrity in the face of it, and essentially to narrate through the dialogue the intellectual dishonesty which is being perpetrated and the kinds of vague generalizations which are being and the straw manning and the false dilemma. Essentially, I mean, that's, I think, what you have to keep on underscoring what the false dilemma is in the premise of what they say, because what they say always already has the dishonesty baked into it, and so you have to kind of you have to extrapolate what they're saying in terms of the false dilemma and then renounce it as such. And then also show the gap in terms of the kinds of solutions that they would have people focus on, and how corrupt those solutions are, how ineffectual they are, and how they essentially privilege people and benefit people that are not disadvantaged, that are not being well targeted by intelligent policy, that they are essentially showing a structure or a plan or a design of statecraft which is essentially the the recipe book of every demagogue, of every disgusting totalitarian nightmare, um, that just gets more and more silly and self uh, destructive. I mean, the truth is that it uses that self destruction as more fuel for their ideological complaining, um, never taking responsibility for essentially uh, the outcome of their uh, irresponsible planning. But I mean, it's more than irresponsible. It's corruption. It's moral corruption, and that moral corruption has a direct consequence in terms of its reliable failure.